In October of 1990, two sisters drove up from the Willamette Valley to visit their grandfather in a timber town called Hollis in the Coast Range of Oregon. They were grown women, 24 and 27. They stayed 3 days. There were words in that house. Half the street heard some of it. One night their car turned out of the old man's driveway, and neither woman was ever seen again. The town knew who to blame. Earl Holt was 73. He had run a saw crew at the coastal mill for 31 years, and there was no one left alive who'd last seen those women but him. No road ever gave them back. They went up Earl's driveway and out of the world, and Earl was the only one still standing at the end of it. His daughter stood up for him. Diane Holt told anyone who'd listen that her father hadn't touched her girls. And the town heard a mother who couldn't bear to lose him too, and believed it of him harder. The county searched one spring, 2 deputies and a pair of dogs, and the logging spurs that branch off the highway and die in the brush, and found a hunter's torn jacket and nothing else. No car, no bodies, no charge, because there was nothing to charge him with. So they convicted him the other way. For 5 years it held. Earl went gray under the weight of what they'd decided he was, and Diane buried 2 daughters she was never allowed to bury, in a town that pitied her and disbelieved her in the same breath. He was dying of it, and of the cancer in his lungs. In the winter of 1995, when Diane found a camera that had belonged to her father and a tape inside it that had never once been played, she put it in to clear him. She never looked at her father the same way again. The camera was in a box of her father's things that Diane had been not dealing with for most of a year. It was a camcorder, the big-shouldered kind from the late 80s, heavy as a brick of meat. Her father had bought it the year Lynn graduated and used it the way men of his generation used such things. Badly, rarely, and then not at all. Diane had brought the box home from his house when the hospice nurse started coming 3 times a week, and it became clear, in the way these things become clear without anyone saying them, that he would not be going back. She had meant to sort it. She had carried it from the truck to the spare room and shut the door on it, because everything in that box was from before, and before was a country she could not yet make herself visit. She opened it now because her father had asked her to. He'd surfaced that afternoon, the way he did between the medication, lucid for a stretch, and he'd asked her about the camera, whether she still had it. There were tapes, he said, of the girls, from before. He thought she should have them while there was still someone to have them, and his voice when he said it was the voice of a man getting his small accounts in order. Diane had said yes, of course, and had gone home and finally opened the door on the spare room because a dying man had asked her for the one thing she'd been avoiding. There were 4 tapes in the box and the camera, and a tape still seated in the camera itself. The 4 were labeled in her father's blocky hand. Christmas, '88. Lynn Grad, Renee and Lynn Summer. One just said, girls. She set those aside with a care that surprised her, the way you handle something you've already decided to let hurt you. Then she took the camera out and saw the tape still in it, and saw that this one had no label at all. She thought nothing of it. A man who labeled 4 tapes and left the 5th blank had simply never finished with the 5th. She found the cable in the bottom of the box, and the spare room had her father's old television in it because she hadn't dealt with that either, and she ran the cable from the camera to the set and sat down on the floor to see her daughters while they were still her daughters. It was the inside of her father's house. She knew it at once. The front room in Hollis, the brown chair, the window with the light coming in the way it came in there in the afternoon. And then Renee crossed the frame, and Diane's breath went out of her, because there was her older girl, alive, moving, real, carrying a coffee cup across her grandfather's front room on an ordinary day 5 years gone. The picture jumped and settled. Her father had been learning the camera, panning it around badly, and you could hear him off-screen, younger by 5 years, saying something about whether the red light was on. Lynn's voice answered him from somewhere. "It's on, Grandpa. You're filming the floor." Diane sat on the floor of the spare room and wept without any sound, the way she had taught herself to weep in a town that watched her, because here they were. Here were her girls in her father's house and her father behind the camera, The three of them together on a day she had not been there for and would never get back. And for a few minutes, the tape gave her the thing she had not had in 5 years, which was simply the sight of them. Lynn flopping into the brown chair, Renee saying something dry that made Lynn laugh. Her father's bad camera work swinging across the room and catching the ordinary furniture of a life that still had everyone in it. And then the mood on the tape changed, and Diane felt it change before she understood why, the way you feel a room go wrong. Renee had stopped laughing. The camera, set down now on a table or a shelf, sat at a crooked angle and caught the front room from low and to the side, and her father had walked into the frame, and he and Renee were standing too far apart and too still. Diane could not hear all of it. The camera was a poor microphone, and they had dropped their voices the way you drop your voice when you do not want it carried, but the shape of it came through. Renee, tight and low, saying something her grandfather did not want to hear. Her father's back going stiff. The same stiffness Diane had grown up reading across a kitchen table, the set of a man who had decided a conversation was over. Lynn, somewhere off frame, saying Renee once, a warning or a plea. And then her father said one thing Diane caught whole because he had raised his voice to say it, the only words on the tape that came through clean. Then you shouldn't have come here. And Renee turned and walked out of the frame, and a door closed somewhere in the house, hard enough that the camera trembled on its shelf. The picture held on the empty front room. The brown chair, the afternoon light, nobody in it. Then it cut to static. Diane reached up and stopped the tape. She did not need to see her father walk back into the room and turn the camera off. She did not need to watch the gray snow where the recording ended. She sat on the floor of the spare room in the blue light of the dead channel and held the thing she had just been given, and it was not the thing she had come into the room to find, because she had spent 5 years saying one sentence to a town that would not hear it. My father did not touch my girls. She had said it at the grocery store and at the gas station and across her own kitchen table, said it until the saying of it was the only ground she had left to stand on, and the town had pitied her and turned away, and she had told herself they were wrong and small and afraid of an open question, and she had believed it. She had needed to believe it the way you need air. And now she had watched her father, on the last day anyone had filmed her daughters alive, stand stiff-backed in his front room and tell Renee, then you shouldn't have come here, in a voice she knew, a hard voice, a voice with something final in it, and watched Renee walk out, and heard a door slam hard enough to shake a camera, and watched the picture cut to nothing. That was the last image. Her girls, in her father's house, in anger. And then the tape ended, the way the town said her daughters' lives had ended, in that house, that day, with that man. She had pressed play to clear him. She sat on the floor in the dark and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the thing she had refused to let herself feel, the small, traitorous opening of a doubt she had spent half a decade holding shut with both hands. She thought, I wasn't there. She thought, I don't actually know what happened in that house. She thought about her father's stiff back and his hard voice and the door, and she thought about the dogs coming back empty off the spurs, and she could not make the doubt close again. She did not look at her father the same way after that. The labeled tapes sat in their neat stack by the box. Christmas '88, Lynn Grad, the ordinary record of the years when she had known exactly who her father was. She did not touch them. She turned off the television and sat in the dark a while longer, and then she got up and went home to a house where the phone might ring with the hospice, and she did not sleep, because for the first time since the night her daughters drove up that driveway, she was not certain the town had been wrong. What she did not know, what she would not know for weeks, because she had stopped the tape at the precise moment a mother's heart would stop it, was that the recording was not over. Past the static, the tape kept going. For 5 years, Diane Holt had been the one person in Hollis who knew her father was innocent, and she had been alone in it, and she had worn the aloneness like a coat she couldn't take off. Now she had watched a tape, and the coat had come off, and she stood in the cold of not knowing, and it was worse than the aloneness had ever been. She did not sleep the night she watched it. She lay in the dark and ran the 7 words again and again. Then you shouldn't have come here. And each time she ran them, they sounded harder. She tried to put them back the way she'd always had her father arranged in her mind, the stubborn, decent man who'd raised her, and they would not go back. A voice with something final in it. A door slammed hard enough to shake a camera. And then her girls, gone. She lay there and did the thing she had refused to do for 5 years, which was to look directly at the question instead of away from it, and the question looked back and did not blink. What she kept colliding with in the dark was how easy it had been for the town. She had spent 5 years thinking the town was cruel and small and lazy, reaching for the nearest man because it could not bear an open question. Now she lay awake and understood, with a sick lurch, how little reaching it had actually required, because the case against her father had never needed to be built. It had only needed to be noticed. He was the last one to see them. That was simply true. Whatever happened, happened after his front room, and the last face anyone could prove her daughters had looked at was his. There had been a fight in the house. She'd known that for 5 years. The Petersons 2 doors down had heard a woman's voice rise and a door go, and Diane had always said families fight, had said it lightly, dismissively, the way you wave off a thing that doesn't matter. It had not occurred to her until she watched the tape that she had been waving off a thing she had never actually seen. Now she had seen it, and families fight sounded thinner in her own mouth at 3 a.m. than it had ever sounded in 5 years of saying it to other people. And her father had gone back to work that next week. She made herself remember that too. He had run his crew at the mill the whole week after the girls vanished, gone in at the same hour, scaled the same logs, and the town had read coldness into it, and Diane had defended even that. That's just how he is. He doesn't show things. 31 years of not showing weakness to the men under him. She still thought that was true. She was almost sure it was true. But almost sure was a new and terrible country, because for 5 years she had not been almost sure of anything about her father. She had been certain, and certainty had been the floor she stood on, and the tape had taken the floor. The cruelty of it, she saw now, was that every single thing the town had against her father was real, not invented, not malicious. He was the last to see them. There was a fight. He did go back to work. None of it was a lie. And she had spent 5 years telling herself that because the facts were innocent, the conclusion was wrong. And now, at 3 a.m, with 7 words in her ears, she could no longer tell the difference between a fact and what a fact might mean, and she understood for the first time that the town had never been able to tell the difference either, and that this was not stupidity. It was just what facts do to people who are frightened and grieving and need an answer. She had been the only one who hadn't needed the answer, because the answer would have been her own father. So she'd held the line, and she wondered now whether her certainty had ever been knowledge at all, or only the one thing a daughter could not afford to doubt. She did not tell anyone about the tape. She could not have said exactly why those first days, except that the tape was the only thing in 5 years that had ever felt like it might be evidence, and she did not yet know which way it cut, and a part of her, the part that had defended him for 5 years, was afraid to find out. So she carried it alone, the way she'd carried everything else. And carrying it alone meant moving back through the town as though nothing had changed, which was its own slow education, because the town had its mind made up and had made it up long ago, and Diane had simply never let herself feel the full weight of it before. She felt it now. She felt it because she was no longer pushing back against it, and a current you stop fighting is a current you finally feel. It was in the way the woman at the pharmacy counter softened her voice when Diane came in, that careful gentleness people use on the bereaved, which Diane had always taken as kindness, and now heard underneath as something else. "We know, dear, we've always known, and we're sorry it was your father." It was in the man at the hardware store who asked after Earl's health and then looked at his own hands. It was in the long habit the whole town had of speaking about the case in the past tense, a settled thing, a grief gone quiet. A quiet that, Diane understood now, had been purchased by deciding it was Earl, because a town cannot rest on an open question, and Hollis had bought its rest 5 years ago and was not going to give it back. She had fought that quiet for 5 years. Now she walked through it carrying a tape she was afraid of, and the quiet felt less like cruelty and more like a verdict that everyone had reached a long time ago and was simply, decently, not making her say out loud. And in the middle of it all, steady as he had been steady for 5 years, was Garrett Royce. He owned the mill, which in a town like Hollis meant he owned more than the mill. He owned the paychecks. He'd put the new roof on the church and the lights on the high school field, and when the county quit searching after that first spring, it was Royce who paid out of his own pocket for the second search, the one that ran another 3 weeks and turned up the same nothing. He had been the one steady thing in the worst season of Diane's life. He had stood beside her at the vigil with his hand on her shoulder while the candles burned down, and he had said, in the voice of a man accustomed to being believed, that Hollis would not rest until those girls were found. He had asked after Earl's health every time their paths crossed since, with a gentleness that never wavered, and told her more than once that the town hadn't given her family a fair shake, that it was a shame how people talked. Diane had been grateful to him for 5 years. In the helpless way you are grateful to the one person who treats you as though you have not been convicted alongside your father. When everyone else softened their voices, Royce had looked her in the eye. She had thanked him at her own kitchen table. She thought of him in those sleepless first days with the tape in her house as the one person in Hollis she might be able to take it to, a man with standing, a man people listened to, a man who had already spent his own money trying to find her girls. If anyone could make the county look again, it was Garrett Royce. She got as far, more than once, as deciding to call him. She didn't in the end, and she could not have told you why those first days. It was not suspicion. She had no reason on earth to suspect Garrett Royce, and the thought never formed. It was something smaller and harder to name, the same instinct that had kept her from telling anyone at all. The tape was the only thing she had. Until she understood it herself, she could not bear to put it in another person's hands, not even kind hands, not even the kindest hands in Hollis. So she held it a little longer. She told herself she'd take it to Royce when she was ready, when she understood what it was. She did not yet understand what it was. She had stopped it at the static, and she had not been able to make herself watch the house footage again, let alone go looking for whatever lay past the gray snow at the end. The tape sat in her father's camera in the spare room, stopped at the worst moment, and Diane moved through the town in the daylight, carrying a doubt about her father she'd never had, and a gratitude toward Garrett Royce she'd had for 5 years. And she did not know, could not have dreamed, that the second of those two things was the one she had wrong. What sent her back to the tape was her father. She had not been to see him in 4 days, the longest she had gone in months, and she knew why and was ashamed of it, and went on the 5th day because the shame was worse than the fear. He was small in the bed by the window, down to the frame of himself, the cancer and the morphine between them, like a third person in the room. But he was lucid that afternoon, more lucid than he'd been in weeks, and he held her hand with a grip that still had something in it. And he talked. He talked about the girls. He did that now, near the end, reaching back past the 5 bad years to the good ones, and Diane sat and let him and braced herself, because she did not know what she would do if her father, dying, said something that closed the door on the doubt, or threw it wide. And in the middle of it, not as a confession, not as anything but an old man turning over an old regret, he said the thing that broke the tape open. He said he should never have let them leave that night. He said it the way you say a thing you've said to yourself 10,000 times. He should have made them stay. It was late and Renee was upset, and he'd been angry. He'd said a hard thing. He told Diane. He'd told Renee she shouldn't have come, and he'd regretted it the second it left his mouth, and he'd let them drive off into the dark, still angry, instead of making them stay the night like he should have. That was his sin, he said, not the thing the town said. He'd sent his girls out angry into the dark, and he'd never seen them again, and a man could not take a thing like that back. Diane sat very still, because that was not the story on the tape. On the tape, the recording ended in the front room with the slam of the door and the cut to static, and she had built 5 sleepless days on the idea that the static was the end, that her girls had walked out of that frame and out of the world, and that her father's hard voice was the last thing before the nothing. But her father had just told her they drove off, that he watched them leave, that he let them go down the driveway in the dark. Which meant there was a piece of that night the tape hadn't shown her, a piece after the door, after the static, because the door slamming was not the girls leaving the house. The door slamming was Renee leaving the room. They'd still been there after, long enough to be talked to, long enough for her father to regret his words and not fix them, long enough to get in the car. The static wasn't the end of the night. It was just the end of what she'd watched. She kissed her father's forehead and told him it wasn't his fault, the words automatic, her mind already 4 miles ahead of her in a spare room with a stopped tape. He held her hand a moment longer and said he was glad she had the tapes now, that she should keep them, that there were things on them worth keeping. And Diane said yes, Dad, and did not know, would spend a long time afterward not knowing, whether her father understood exactly what was on that unlabeled tape, or whether a dying man was only glad his daughter would have something of the girls when he was gone. She drove home faster than she should have. The spare room was as she'd left it, the camera still cabled to the old television, the tape stopped at the static. She sat down on the floor where she'd sat 5 days before, and she found the place, and she made herself watch past the gray snow, and this time she did not stop. The static ran for a stretch. 10 seconds, 15, the camera off and then on again, a different day in the quality of the light. And then the picture came back, and it was not her father's front room. It was the lot of a gas station. Pale daylight, washed the way that old film washes everything. 2 pumps, a stretch of asphalt, a road running off behind. A counter in the corner ticking up white seconds. For a moment, Diane did not understand what she was looking at, or why her father's camera was looking at it, and then she stopped trying to understand, and just watched, because a car was pulling into the frame, and it was Lynn's car, and she knew it by the dent in the rear quarter panel that Lynn had never fixed. She put her hand over her mouth. Both doors opened. Her daughters got out. Alive, not in the front room 5 days and 5 years ago, but here, somewhere else, somewhere later, moving in the pale light, Renee saying something across the roof of the car and Lynn laughing at it, and the hope came up in Diane so hard and so fast it was almost pain, because the tape had just told her what the front room hadn't. They left. They got in the car, and they drove off into the dark like her father said, and they did not vanish off his property, and they were not dead in the woods behind his house, because here they were at a gas station on a road somewhere, alive, getting fuel. After. Her father had done nothing. It landed on her all at once, 5 years of it, and she sat on the floor and shook with it. The thing she had said to a town that wouldn't hear, my father did not touch my girls, and here was the proof in pale daylight. Here was the answer to the doubt that had eaten 5 nights of her, and the answer was the one she'd defended for 5 years before she ever wavered. He was clean. He had always been clean. The 7 words on the front room footage were just an old man being hard with a frightened girl, and the door was just a door, and her daughters had walked out of that house and gotten in the car and lived long enough to stop for gas on a highway. And her father had spent 5 years being ground to nothing by a town for a thing that never happened in his house at all. She was weeping with relief, watching her dead daughters pump gas when the second vehicle pulled into the lot. A truck. It came in slow and parked at the edge of the frame, and a man got out, and Diane watched him cross the lot toward her daughter's car with the unhurried ease of a man who had nothing in the world to be afraid of, and she felt the relief in her chest begin, very slowly, to turn to something else. Because her daughters knew him, there was no alarm in them. Lynn rolled the window down. The man leaned to it with one hand on the roof of the car, easy, and the 3 of them talked the way you talk to someone you trust, someone familiar, someone safe. Diane leaned toward the screen. The film was poor, and the man's back was half to the camera, and she could not see his face, not yet, and she found that she was holding her breath without having decided to, that some part of her had gone ahead of the rest and already did not want to see. The man straightened from the window. He said something, and Lynn nodded, and he turned to walk back toward his truck. And for 1 second, 2, The camera caught him from the side as he turned, caught the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw and the particular way he carried himself, a man accustomed to being looked at and never questioned. Diane knew him before her mind would let her say it. She knew him the way you know a face you have stood next to. She had stood next to that face at a vigil while the candles burned down. She had felt that man's hand on her shoulder. She had sat at her own kitchen table and thanked him, and she had walked past him at the hardware store the previous Sunday and let him ask after her father's health in that steady, kind, unwavering voice. And she had thanked him for that too. Garrett Royce. On the screen, Royce got back in his truck. Her daughter's car pulled out of the lot toward the highway, and the truck pulled out behind it, the two of them turning the same direction onto the same road, and the frame went back to an empty lot. Pale daylight, the white seconds ticking up, the highway running off behind the pumps to nothing. Diane did not move. She sat on the floor of the spare room in the going dark, and she understood, in pieces, in the slow, terrible way the mind admits a thing it cannot survive, admitting all at once what she had just watched. She had watched the last footage of her daughters alive. They had left her father's house alive, both of them, and her father was innocent. And the last thing the camera caught them doing, the last anyone would ever see of Lynn and Renee Holt, was driving away down a highway with Garrett Royce following behind them. The man who paid for the second search. The man who stood beside her at the vigil and said the town would not rest until her girls were found. The man she had thanked. She thought she might be sick. She thought distantly that she should call someone, and then she thought about who there was to call. About a town that belonged to Garrett Royce, the paychecks and the church roof and the lights on the field, a county that had searched where Royce paid it to search. And the thought of the telephone made her colder than anything on the tape had. She sat on the floor and did not reach for the phone. She sat there a long time in the blue light of the dead channel, holding the only proof in the world that her father was innocent, and that the proof and the answer were the same 90 seconds, and that the answer was a man the whole town would defend with everything it had. She had spent 5 years needing someone to believe her father didn't do it. Now she knew who did. And she understood, sitting in the dark, that knowing was going to be worse than not knowing had ever been, because the not knowing had only cost her sleep, and the knowing was going to cost her everything against a man who owned the ground she'd have to fight him on. For 2 days Diane did nothing, because there was nothing she knew how to do. She had a tape of a truck following her daughter's car onto a highway. She understood what it meant the way you understand a thing in your body before you can prove it to anyone else. And she understood just as fast that meaning and proof were 2 different countries, and that she lived in the first and Garrett Royce lived in the second. A truck follows a car. That was all a stranger would see. 2 vehicles leaving a gas station in the same direction on a public road 5 years ago on a tape with no date a man could read off it. She knew it was the last thing. She could not yet say how she knew, only that her daughters had looked at that man the way you look at someone safe, and that no one had ever seen them again, and that the man had spent 5 years making sure the town looked at her father instead. But why? That was the hole at the center of it, and Diane could not fill it from the tape. The tape gave her the man. It did not give her the reason, and without the reason the man was untouchable, because a county does not move on the most powerful man in it over a truck on a highway, not without a reason so heavy it cannot be set down. So she went looking for the reason in the only place a woman with no authority could look, which was the past. She started with the simplest question, the one she had never asked in 5 years because the answer had never seemed to matter. Why had the girls come to Hollis at all? She had told herself and the town that it was a visit. Grown daughters up to see their grandfather a few days, nothing more. But she sat with it now, and the visit did not hold the way it used to. They had come in October, midweek, on no occasion, not a birthday, not a holiday. Lynn had taken days off a job she could not easily take days off from, and they had not told Diane they were going until they were nearly there, which she had let herself read for 5 years as the casual thoughtlessness of grown children, and which read differently now that she was looking at it instead of past it. They had not been coming to Hollis. They had been coming to be near something. And the only thing in Hollis worth driving 4 hours midweek to be near, the thing that ran the whole town, was the mill. Renee had worked that last year for a firm in the valley that did books, payroll, accounts, the unglamorous paper that keeps companies legal. Diane had known this and never connected it to anything, because why would she? She connected it now, and once she had connected it, she could not stop connecting things, the way you cannot stop once the first thread comes loose. She did not have access to anything. That was the wall she hit again and again over the days that followed. She was a grieving mother in a small town, not a detective, not a lawyer, not anyone with the standing to demand a document or compel an answer. What she had was a telephone, a long memory, and the particular invisibility of a woman everyone had already decided to pity. People talked to her precisely because they did not think she was anyone to worry about. So she made calls. She called an old friend of Lynn's who'd worked the same firm and had since moved away, and she did not say what she suspected, only that she was trying to understand her daughter's last months, which was true, and which opened a door that a direct question would have closed. And the friend, careful at first and then not, told her a thing Renee had mentioned once, near the end, and then asked her not to repeat. There had been a job the firm took on, a mill up in the Coast Range. Renee had been put on the accounts, and somewhere in the accounts there had been a death. A man killed at the mill, on the floor, the kind of death that happens in that work and is supposed to generate a wall of paper. The report, the inspection, the insurance, the citation. And the paper had not matched. The death in the records was not the death that had happened. The when of it had been moved, or the how or the where on the property. Moved just enough that a thing which should have shut the mill down for a season, which should have cost the owner a fortune in fines and liability, and maybe the mill itself, had instead cost him almost nothing. A man had died, and the paper had been made to say he died some other cheaper way. And Renee, doing the unglamorous accounts, had been the one to notice that the numbers did not describe the same death twice. Diane sat with the phone in her hand after the friend hung up and felt the hole at the center of it begin, terribly, to fill. Because she could see it now, the whole shape, and it was not the shape of a monster. That was the part that turned her stomach worst. She had wanted, in 2 days of knowing it was Royce, for there to be a monster at the bottom of this. A man who took her daughters because he was the kind of man who takes daughters, a sickness she could hate cleanly. There was no such man. There was a businessman who had buried a workplace death to save his mill, the way men in his position had buried such things before, a cold and ordinary crime that the town would never even have known to look for. And then a young woman doing the books 4 hours away had noticed the paper didn't match, and had been troubled by it, and had not known, could not have known, that noticing was the most dangerous thing she would ever do. What Diane could not fully reconstruct, and never would, was the rest of it. The exact machinery of how a noticed discrepancy became 2 women driving to Hollis became a truck on a highway. She could see the edges. Renee, troubled, not sure what she'd found or what to do with it, maybe reaching out, to the mill, to Royce, to somebody, in the careful, reasonable way of a person who thinks they have stumbled onto a mistake rather than a crime, who imagines it can be raised and corrected, who does not understand yet what kind of man is on the other end of the question. And Royce, who understood exactly what kind of man he was, recognizing what Diane's daughter had found before Diane's daughter fully did. The girls coming to Hollis, to be near it, to look closer, to decide what to do. The fight in Earl's front room, which Diane now understood at last. Not Renee afraid of her grandfather, but Renee afraid and Lynn afraid, and the 2 of them arguing about how far they had to run from a thing they'd stumbled into. Then you shouldn't have come here, an old man's frightened, clumsy way of saying, "You've brought something dangerous to my door, and I don't know how to keep you safe from it." And Royce, who owned the town, who owned the sheriff's budget and the county's gratitude, who had buried 1 death already and knew exactly how the paper worked. Royce had simply done it again. More carefully this time, because this time there were 2 of them, and they were not mill hands, but a bookkeeper and her sister, and they could not be made to look like an industrial accident. So he had not tried. He had made them vanish instead into a disappearance the town was primed to read as something else entirely. And then he had paid for the search that looked in the wrong place and stood at the vigil and let an old man take the weight. He had not needed to be a monster. He had only needed to be a man who had done this kind of thing once already and had the whole apparatus of a town to do it with. Diane understood, sitting there, that she had been wrong about what she was fighting. She had thought those first 2 days that she was fighting to prove a powerful man had done a terrible thing. She was not. The terrible thing was almost the smallest part of it. What she was fighting was the apparatus. The mill, the money, the sheriff who answered to the budget Royce funded, the county that had searched where Royce paid it to search, the whole town that would close around Garrett Royce the way it had closed around the idea of her father's guilt, because Royce was the good the place had left and her father was only the man who'd been standing there. The death of one mill worker and the deaths of her 2 daughters were not 3 separate crimes. They were one crime, committed once and then defended for 5 years by everything Garrett Royce owned. And Garrett Royce owned nearly everything. She had a tape of a truck following a car. Against all of that, she had a tape of a truck following a car, and a thing a frightened friend had told her on the phone and asked her not to repeat, and the certainty in her own body and her dying father, and nothing else at all. She understood, finally, why she had not reached for the telephone in the spare room. It was not shock, and it was not grief. It was that some part of her had already known, before she could say it, that there was no one on the other end of that phone who did not, in some way, belong to Garrett Royce. She took it to the county anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and she had done nothing for 5 years, and it had cost her father everything. She did not take it to the sheriff. Even Diane, who knew almost nothing about how these things worked, knew enough not to walk a tape implicating Garrett Royce into an office that ran on a budget Garrett Royce helped fund. She drove instead to the district attorney's office in the county seat, 2 towns over, and sat in a waiting room for most of a morning with the camera in a canvas bag on her lap, and was finally given 20 minutes with an assistant prosecutor who was younger than she'd hoped, and kind in the way that is its own kind of answer. She had rehearsed it. She told it in order: the tape her father left, the front room, the static, the gas station past the static, the truck, the man getting out, the man her daughters knew. She said the name. She watched it land on the young prosecutor, and she watched him keep his face still, the way you keep your face still when someone says a name that changes the room. And then she told him the rest, the part she'd assembled on the phone, the mill, the death in the records that didn't match, Renee on the accounts, the noticing. She laid it all out on his desk, 5 years of it, and when she was done, she felt for one moment the enormous relief of having finally handed it to someone whose job it was to do something. He watched the tape. He asked her to play it twice. He was not unkind, and he was not stupid, and that was the worst of it, because a cruel or stupid man she could have hated, and what she got instead was a careful one. He told her what she had. He told her gently, the way you tell someone something they need to hear and will not survive hearing well. She had 2 vehicles leaving a gas station 5 years ago on a tape with no date that could be established to a legal standard. The clock in the corner was meaningless, the film stock impossible to pin to a day. She had a man, recognizable, yes, getting out of a truck and speaking to 2 women through a car window, in daylight, in public, with no sign of force, no sign of fear, nothing that any jury on earth would see as a crime, because it was not, on its face, a crime. People talk at gas stations. 2 cars leaving in the same direction was 2 cars leaving in the same direction. And the rest of it, the mill, the records, the death that didn't match, was a thing a frightened woman had told her on a telephone and would, the prosecutor would bet his career, deny ever having said the moment anyone with a subpoena came near her, because that woman had a life and a family and no wish to stand up in a courtroom against Garrett Royce. And then he said the thing that Diane understood was the true wall under all the rest. He said it as carefully as he'd said everything, and it was the cruelest thing anyone said to her in the whole 5 years, precisely because it was true, and he was sorry to say it. He said, "You understand how this looks." He meant a tape that surfaces, conveniently, in the possession of the daughter of the man this whole county spent 5 years believing did it, A mother who never accepted her father's guilt, who had said for 5 years that the town was wrong, who now arrived with a piece of film that pointed the finger at the most respected man in the region. A man who had, by every public account, done nothing but try to help her family. He did not believe she had faked it. He said so, and Diane believed that he believed it. But it did not matter what he believed. It mattered what could be made of it in a courtroom by a lawyer working for Garrett Royce. And what could be made of it was a grieving woman's last desperate attempt to clear her father by pinning her daughter's disappearance on a pillar of the community, on evidence that proved 2 cars left a gas station. He told her that no prosecutor in the county would file on it. He told her that if anyone did, it would be destroyed in a week, and that the destroying of it would not just fail to touch Royce, it would brand Diane permanently as the woman who'd tried and failed to frame the man who'd searched for her own daughters. It would make Royce a victim. It would close the last door her family had. He gave her the tape back. He told her, off the record, leaning forward, that he was sorry, that he didn't doubt her, that if she ever got anything else, anything that put Royce and the girls in the same place, anything from the mill, anything with a date on it, to come straight back to him. And Diane understood that this was a real kindness and an empty one in the same breath, because there was nothing else, and there was never going to be anything else, because the only other people who knew were dead or were Garrett Royce, and Garrett Royce was not going to leave anything with a date on it lying in a box for her to find. She drove home with the camera on the passenger seat. She did not cry. She had cried on the floor of the spare room, and she would cry again, but not on that drive. On that drive she was past it, in the flat, cold country past grief, where you simply hold a thing that cannot be put down. She had been right. That was what she carried home. For 5 years the town had been wrong, and she had been right, and she had the proof of it on the seat beside her, and being right had bought her exactly nothing. Her father was innocent, and she could not make it matter. The man who took her daughters was going to keep signing the paychecks and putting roofs on churches and being thanked, and there was no force on earth available to a woman like her that could reach a man like him. The proof and the answer were the same 90 seconds, and the 90 seconds were not enough, and they were never going to be enough, because Garrett Royce had built his crime out of exactly the materials a town would refuse to see. She went to see her father. He was near the end now. Days, the nurse said, maybe less. He drifted more than he surfaced, but he surfaced for her that afternoon, the grip still faintly there, and he looked at her, and Diane had to decide, sitting beside the bed, what to do with the only thing she had ever wanted to be able to tell him. She had come meaning to tell him. She had driven over rehearsing it the way she'd rehearsed the prosecutor. "You were right, Dad. You didn't do it. I have proof. I always knew. The whole town was wrong." She had wanted, for 5 years, to be able to lay that in his hands before he went. And she sat beside him with it ready, and she watched his face, drifting and peaceful, in a way it had not been peaceful in 5 years, a man very close to the end of a long, hard thing, and she understood what telling him would actually do, because she could not tell him he was innocent without telling him who was guilty. The two were the same 90 seconds. And if she told her father, in the last days of his life, that his granddaughters had driven off down a highway behind Garrett Royce, that the girls had died because Renee noticed a number that didn't match, that they'd come to him, to his house, for shelter, and he hadn't been able to give it, that then, "You shouldn't have come here," had been the last hard thing he ever said to a frightened girl he could not save. If she told him all of that, she would not be giving him peace. She would be handing a dying man the knowledge that the people who killed his granddaughters were going to walk free in the town he'd given his life to, and that there was nothing that he or his daughter could ever do about it. She would be replacing a guilt that was not true with a grief that was, and the grief was heavier than the guilt had ever been. So she did not tell him. She sat beside her father in the last days of his life, and she let him believe what he had believed, that he had failed the girls by letting them leave angry, an old man's ordinary regret, a sin small enough to die with. She held his hand, and she told him it wasn't his fault, and that was true, truer than he knew, and she let the truer reason go unsaid. She let him keep the smaller grief because the larger one would have had no mercy in it. The one gift she had spent 5 years wanting to give him, You were right. She finally had in her hands, and she understood that the kindest thing she could do with it was to keep it. Earl Holt died 11 days later in the town that had spat on his shadow for 5 years, believed guilty by nearly everyone in it, and innocent, known to be innocent by exactly one person who had the proof in a canvas bag in her closet and could never use it, and who sat with him at the end and let him go, thinking his worst sin was a slammed door. There is no justice in this one. It should be said plainly, because the story has not earned the right to pretend otherwise. Lynn and Renee Holt are somewhere the tape does not show, and Diane will never find, because the man who knows did not survive 5 years of being the most careful man in the county by leaving them somewhere findable. Garrett Royce owns the mill still. He signs the checks still. He put money toward the new wing of the county hospital the year after Earl died, and there is a plaque with his name on it, and people in Hollis say he is a good man, and in the only sense the town can measure, he has been. He was never charged. He was never suspected. He will most likely die in that town, an honored man, and be buried under a stone that people leave flowers on. And the worst thing that will ever happen to him is that one woman 2 towns over knows exactly what he is, and can do nothing with the knowing but carry it. And Diane Holt has the tape still. She kept it. She could not use it, and she could not destroy it. The only proof in the world that her father was innocent and her daughters were taken, and she keeps it in a canvas bag in her closet. And some nights she takes it out and does not play it, because she knows every frame of it by heart, and because the only thing watching it would tell her is the thing she already knows, which is that she was right, and that being right was the thing it cost her everything to learn she could not spend. That is where it ends, not because it is finished, because that is as far as the truth was ever allowed to get.